All right, I'm going to press the admit button and we'll see everybody starting to come into our room. Here we go.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to press the admit button and we'll see everybody starting to come into our room.
Good evening, everyone. It looks like we're the Zoom software is still admitting a few people, so I'll give it just about half a minute and we'll get started. So nice to see everyone this evening. Okay, we'll get started. Good evening, all. For those few of you who might not recognize me, my name is Lon Combs. I am an associate professor of architecture here at RPI's School of Architecture, and I welcome you, all the guests, and to the faculty and the students who do recognize me. I welcome you as well, obviously. And it's great that you guys are joining tonight for the 5th annual Arthur T. Kornblut Lecture, Memorial Lecture. So officially, good evening and welcome to the 5th annual Arthur T. Kornblut Memorial Lecture, which will provide information to you on legal issues affecting architects. So Dr. Arthur Kornblut was a 1963 graduate of our School of Architecture. He was an architect and a lawyer, and he was engaged in legal issues pertaining to architects and architectural practice. Dr. Kornblut's family provided funding to honor his memory with a lecture series here at Rensselaer, which we are now thrilled to have in the 5th year, in the 5th annual installment. The purpose of these lectures, or this lecture series, is to inform architecture students about legal matters that will be important to you as you progress in your professional career. We're very grateful to Dr. Kornblut's family for making this lecture series possible. So for this 5th annual lecture, it's my pleasure to introduce to you this in an online format, lecture titled Conflicting Loyalties, Ethics, and the Architect by J. Wickersham, practicing architect and practicing lawyer, or architect and lawyer. J. Wickersham has worked in all aspects of design as an architect, an urban planner, a government regulator, and a lawyer. Jay is a founding partner in the Cambridge, Massachusetts law firm Noble, Wickersham & Hart. Noble, Wickersham & Hart represents architectural and design firms around the country and internationally. He previously served for 4 years as the Assistant Secretary of Environmental Affairs for Massachusetts. Jay has taught for 15 years as a professor in practice at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he is focused on the history, law, and ethics of architectural practice. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School, the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and Yale University, and he is a registered architect with 10 years of professional experience. In 2018, Jay was the president of the Boston Society of Architects. He is currently preparing the first major publication of the drawings of the great American architect, H.H. Richardson, and his CEO. So, Jay, it's a true pleasure to have you with us tonight, and we all look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Lon. I really appreciate this, and it's a wonderful chance to talk today. I'm now going to take just a second to get my presentation up on the screen. And does that look good? I assume it does.
It looks great. If you can hear me, yes.
Yes, I can. Okay, great. Okay, so the topic I've chosen tonight is one of what I've called conflicting loyalties, ethics and the architect. And so let me say a few preliminary words about this. I find ethics a really wonderful and fascinating way to think about how we make architecture, because it's a way of constantly reminding ourselves of how this is a collaborative venture. You know, we don't make architecture by ourselves. We work collaboratively with our colleagues within architecture firms. We work collaboratively with our clients. They're the ones who give us the opportunity to carry out projects. It's their money that we're spending when we're designing and building something. And we are working with the public in all kinds of ways. The people who live in or who work in a building, everyone who experiences the buildings that we create. And so what I like about ethics is that ethics can be framed as a series of loyalties. You know, what is our loyalty to our fellow colleagues? You know, what is our loyalty as an architect to the client? What is our loyalty to the public? And the really interesting questions are, what happens when these loyalties come into conflict? There are no fixed answers. You're going to be wrestling with conflicting loyalties for the rest of your careers. And so what I hope to do tonight is to start to pose some of these conflicts. The way I'm going to do that is by going back in time. I'm really interested in the history of architectural practice. And I believe that we can't understand where we are today. We can't understand what are going to be our ethical challenges for the future if we don't understand how we got here, how we built up the structure of ethical rules and codes, all of these assumptions about what it means to practice architecture that we currently live with. And so what I will do is to give a series of snapshots in time. These will be a series of stories, and many of them will involve some famous architects. They will involve some very famous buildings. But I hope that these stories will give a new perspective on these architects, these buildings, and give you a sense of the ethical loyalties they were struggling with, and perhaps some suggestions about how to wrestle out these same loyalties as you move into your own careers. So I'm going to start in the Middle Ages. And the key loyalty here is your loyalty to your colleagues. And the colleagues back then in Europe in the time of the great cathedrals were your colleagues within the Masons Guild. The Masons Guild was the first organization of architects, and it provided the same kinds of roles that our organizations play today. It was a system of training. It was a system of examination, in effect of registration, because once you had become a full-fledged member of the Masons Guild by passing an examination, you could then enter into practice. And there were a couple of points about what loyalty meant to your colleagues in 13th century France, let's say, that are important to point out. The first is that your colleagues were builders as well as designers. The Masons Guild was responsible for every aspect of the creation of a building. There was no distinction between design and construction. If you signed a contract, you would be responsible for that entire course. Then I want to talk about two particular aspects of the loyalty. One had to do with money. Masons Guilds were very clear about setting prices for their services. There was a fixed price that you charged every client for your services of design and construction. And no member of the guild was allowed to undercut his colleagues by offering a lower price. So there was a loyalty that had an economic side to it. The other side of loyalty had to do with trade secrets. We see here a sketchbook on the left This is the best preserved example of a medieval architect's sketchbook. This is by Villard de Hononcourt, a 13th century French architect who traveled from northern France as far east as Hungary, sketching, measuring, drawing the buildings he saw. These sketchbooks were exchanged among your colleagues, but it was a severe breach of your loyalty to ever let these trade secrets be seen to anyone outside of the Masons Guild. And there is in fact a story that a bishop at one point bribed a member of the guild and got hold of a sketchbook. Presumably this was so that he could go around them, maybe hire some workers on his own. The guild did not take this lightly. They hired an assassin and they had the bishop murdered. So loyalty to your clients and protection of your loyalty to your colleagues and the protection of your colleagues' intellectual property was absolutely kind of at the core of architectural practice back in the Middle Ages. And I would suggest that some of these same questions of loyalty to our colleagues kind of continue to be things we are wrestling with today. You can see here one final point is, where did the medieval architect stand in the social hierarchy? Well, I think this sculpture from the front of a cathedral in Germany shows that very clearly. A mason was a craftsman. Here he is bent almost double like a beast of burden with this presentation model of a cathedral supported on his back. And here you see the clients, the donors, the rich couple who were undoubtedly the principal donors to the building fund. They are much better dressed. They are in fact actually larger in the sculpture. There's no question here where the architect stands within the social hierarchy. And that we also need to bear in mind, because social status has always been a part of the architectural profession and questions about it. What we see here now in my first jump forward in time to the Renaissance is a transformation in the architect's social status, and it's a transformation in his sense of where his loyalties lie. The architect in this sketch is the man in the middle, and you will see that he is chatting with the members of the building committee. He is dressed like them in a flowing robe. He's wearing a similar elegant hat. He is clearly talking with them as a social equal. And he is clearly also not dressed like the builder, seated there at the table at the left, holding a hammer in one hand, kind of impatiently waiting, no doubt, for the architect to turn over the drawings so that he could continue forward with his work. So what we see here is now a different conception of loyalty. Loyalty to your clients, a hope that your clients will treat you as a social equal, and a distancing of yourself from your former colleagues, from those members of the Masons Guild, who in the Renaissance were now started to be seen as tools in the hands of the architect. From Alberti onward, the Renaissance architects were very clear that they were men of learning and culture, and they gave directions to the builder. The idea that the builder might have knowledge, might have expertise that would contribute to the design of the building was not something that played a large role in Renaissance architectural theory. So here are two ideas of loyalties, and where they come into conflict in a very striking way is in this building, which is, of course, one of the foundational buildings of the Renaissance, the dome of the Florence Cathedral. The dome was designed and brought to completion by the architect Brunelleschi. And the story of how Brunelleschi completed this project, as told by the art historian Vasari, is one of the great texts of architectural history. Vasari goes to great lengths to let us know what a genius Brunelleschi was, how he was seen as a man of great talents by his clients, by the building committee, how what he did was so remarkable. There is, however, a part of the story of the Florence Cathedral that Vasari left out because it didn't really fit in with his view of the architect. When the project got underway, the head of the Masons Guild in Florence went to a judge, and he swore out a complaint against Brunelleschi. He said that Brunelleschi was in essence practicing without a license. He was not a member of the Masons Guild. He had not paid his dues to the Masons Guild. And the judge had Brunelleschi thrown in jail. Brunelleschi, of course, was well connected. He got the word to his clients, the members of the building committee, and they had the head of the Masons Guild thrown in jail. And so from this conflict between the colleagues and the client, a compromise was worked out. And although you will not read this in Vasari, the dome of the cathedral was actually the product of two leading figures. Brunelleschi in charge of the design, but the head of the Masons Guild in charge of carrying out the construction. And so kind of here, as I said, you will see in one of the foundational buildings of the Renaissance, embedded in it is this idea of where do your loyalties lie and what is the architect's role. I'm now going to do another jump forward in time. This time, 5 centuries ahead. We are now, no, I'm sorry, 4.5 centuries ahead. Doing the math in my head. We are now in mid-19th century America, around the time of the Civil War. And the emergent community of professional architects in the United States are still wrestling with this question: where do our loyalties lie? And how do we balance loyalties to our colleagues versus loyalties to our clients? And they come up with a different answer from in the Renaissance. This man here on the right is Richard Morris Hunt. He was the leading American architect at the time of the Civil War. He was the first American to get a professional education at the Aia Code of Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had a lot of design training. He could turn out buildings in any style, a house in the French Chateau Loire style, or maybe you'd like something a little more Italian, early 16th century. And you can see in this publicity photo, he went to great pains with his costume to demonstrate that he had his artistic skills and knowledge. He also worked at very large scales. He did corporate headquarters towers like this one in Lower Manhattan. And what he understood, he and his colleagues who formed the AIA, the American Institute of Architects in New York City in 1857, was that if they were going to be able to prosper in this kind of swashbuckling world of American capitalism in the 19th century, they needed to band together. This was now no longer colleagues in the building trades. This was a loyalty to your fellow architectural colleagues. The AIA adopted a series of rules for membership, all of them aimed at raising their social status and demonstrating their expertise. To be an AIA member, you ought to have a university education, and very soon architecture schools were developing across the country. It took a little more time, but eventually the AIA agreed to the idea of government licensing, that architects should pass an exam and hold a government license. And again, they saw the value of this ultimately because it showed that they were an educated, trained elite, a profession like law, like medicine, and therefore a profession that would be respected in the eyes of their clients. Loyalty to colleagues, they also came up with something of the same solution that the medieval guilds had, which is don't undercut your colleagues in terms of price. The AIA, just like the medieval Masons Guild, said, we are all going to charge the same fixed fee. Once somebody has a commission, we're not going to compete against one another. We're not going to try to take jobs away from each other. We're going to protect each other. And that's one way that we can kind of show solidarity and build up our stature. And a final point was that to be an architect, you could not be a builder. This is where the gap between design and construction really becomes definitive. Now, there was a good reason for this. There was a lot of shoddy construction in 19th century America, and the belief was that in order to get quality, it was very important that the architect be loyal only to the client in terms of construction. The architect prepares the plans and specifications, but then the architect is not paid for construction. The architect isn't paid by the builder. The architect supervises the builder to make sure that the client is getting the quality that the client wanted. So, as I said, there is a good reason why architecture gets separated from building in the mid-19th century, but it has consequences, and we will see some of those consequences as we go ahead. So now let me give my second story of a conflict. This one brings up into play the greatest American architect of the 19th century, Henry Hobson Richardson. He was a man whose skills were as enormous as his personality and his girth. You see him here in this kind of wonderful, expansive portrait that's in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington today. And the building that he was involved in that really highlights the conflict between these new ideas of loyalty to colleagues versus loyalty to your client is right across the river from RPI. It is the New York State Capitol, the Albany State House. And if you haven't been to see it, I strongly urge everyone in this lecture to go and see it because Richardson created there some of the most spectacular interiors in all of American architecture. But before we talk about that, let's talk about how he got the job, because that's an interesting and a revealing story. Richardson got involved with the State House in 1875. At that point, the project had already been going on for 8 years. The state government had hired an architect out of Canada, a man named Fuller, and this was the original design that he came up with. It has a little bit of everything. You know, you want a pediment, we've got that. You want porticos, you want mansard roofs, you want towers, you want the Temple of Halicarnassus at the very top, you know, pretty much anything an architect could throw into one building you have here. But after 8 years of work, all that had been constructed of this confection was the foundations and the basement. A new governor was elected. He was extremely impatient. He said, "What's going on with this project?" And so he hired a peer review team to take a look. It consisted of Richardson, of another very experienced architect named Eidlitz, and of Richardson's great friend, Frederick Law Olmsted, the leading landscape architect of the time. The three of them examined the design, examined the work. They concluded that the quality of the construction was acceptable. They didn't need to rip it all out, but they had some very pointed things to say about the design. They said that the exterior was an incoherent and unnecessarily expensive mess. They said the interiors were even worse. They were very poorly planned, bad lighting, bad acoustics, bad communication. And so being architects, they came up with their own scheme. This is the alternative design that Richardson and Eidlitz developed. You know, it's not their strongest work. I think they would have admitted that themselves. They had to work with the existing foundations. They had to work with that program, but at least it had the benefit of being simple, clean, dignified. The governor liked it much more. He had complete trust in this new team in a way that he had lost his trust with the previous architect. And so he engaged Richardson, Eidlitz, and Olmsted to carry out the project. And Richardson then had the opportunity to cut loose some of the most talented designers in all of American architecture. Richardson had developed a very high quality studio. I've had the amazing opportunity to look at the drawings. There are more than 200 surviving design studies of the Albany State House that are in the Harvard Rare Book Library. And so you can really see the process of design and how Richardson really hired talented people and let them explore. This is a sketch almost certainly by Stanford White, who went on to found McKim, Mead, and White. And he is looking at the ceiling of the Senate chamber, and you can see him thinking as he's drawing, sketching out ideas in perspective, looking at different pieces of it, drawing an elevation, looking at alternative details, even how the metal strap work is going to go together. You know, all of it producing, when you go over there, what you will find is an extraordinarily rich and lavish interior. And then there's an amazing series of drawings of the other great interior, the Western Staircase, section drawings, the enormously complicated plan. The section goes up 4 stories, beautifully drawn details of column capitals, all of it resulting in one of the most extraordinary Piranesian staircases in all of American architecture. So you would think, from the viewpoint of the AIA, what's not to like? The leading American member of the architectural profession has been given control of one of the most prominent buildings in America, and has demonstrated, what architects can do. Well, instead, Richardson's colleagues, Richard Morris Hunt and the other members of the AIA, went ballistic. They made a huge protest, not just within the profession, but a public protest. They published letters in newspapers. They testified to the state legislature. They appealed to the governor. And their point was that Richardson had been disloyal to his colleagues, that he and Eidlitz and Olmsted had finagled this project away from the original architect, and that was a cardinal sin. The fact that that original architect had proven to be pretty much incompetent, the fact that the quality of the design that they were now giving to the client was hugely better than what had previously been created, to them was not as important as loyalty to one's colleagues. And so these two principles are coming kind of squarely in conflict in this building. The governor was not impressed by the AIA. He paid no attention to them. Richardson, Eidlitz, and Olmsted just kept their heads down. They didn't dignify it with a response. They just kept working. The project went on for many years. It wasn't completed until years after Richardson's death, but largely to his design. And so, as I've said, when you go over there, you will get an extraordinary experience, but in it, you will also see embedded these conflicting ideas of the architect's role and his ethical loyalties in late 19th century America. So now I'm going to jump ahead another century, where we're now in America in the 1950s. And one of the things that's quite extraordinary is, for all of the changes in architecture, the difference between Richardson's work and the work of Mies and Le Corbusier and Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill in the 1950s, the ethical conception of the architect's role and of the architect's loyalties had changed very little. The AIA Code of Ethics, as it existed in the 1950s and into the 1960s, was pretty much the same. Your loyalty to your colleagues was paramount. You did not compete in terms of business. You did not undercut your colleagues in terms of fees. You didn't advertise. You didn't try to take away a client. Take away a job if one of your colleagues had already been hired. You also did not participate in construction. That rule also was inviolable. And so the loyalty to your client was seen in this professional role of overseeing the construction process, ensuring that the design that you had come up with was properly carried out by the contractor. So, it was a time of kind of great growth in the profession, a great sort of building boom, and the AIA had grown. The AIA by now had thousands of members, but there was still, I would say, a kind of insular, clubby feeling to it. Often I think it's popular culture that can give us real insights into these kinds of issues. And I love this still photograph from the movie version of The Fountainhead. This is Gary Cooper playing Howard Rourke, Ayn Rand's architect hero. And I think, in fact, it's a very revealing photograph because it says a lot about the conception of the architect that the AIA still held in the 1950s. An architect is an artist. He here is clutching the model that he has created. But he's also a man who stands on a social par with his clients. He's a man of culture, of education. He wears a well-tailored suit. He's comfortable in the halls of power. He's comfortable in a corporate boardroom, in a tower high above an American city. And you also know he is a man of ethical standards. You know this because he's played by Gary Cooper and because his gaze is raised a little bit above the horizontal. It's a sense, as I said, of an idealistic sense of the architect, but a rather insular, self-satisfied sense. And what would happen in the next 20 years, up through in the 1960s and 70s, up to about 1980, is that this entire ethical framework of the professional American architect all comes, sort of tumbling down in ruins. There is a series of attacks, and those attacks and the new ideas of where the architect owes his ethical loyalties is very telling, and it really lays the groundwork for the challenges that we are facing today. The first of these attacks had to do with money. It was on the idea that architects could be this insular group who wouldn't compete with each other in the marketplace. This was an idea that, interestingly, came under attack from both sides, both from the political right and from the political left. On the political right, you had people like Milton Friedman and other real advocates for the unfettered free market, saying that fixed fee schedules, other constraints on competition, this was all illegal price fixing. This was a constraint on competition, and it was causing clients to have to pay more money than they should. And it was a brake on innovation. It meant that architects weren't having to be as innovative and creative as they needed to be in order to figure out how to offer the same services at a more competitive price. At the same time, you had the political left attacking architects and the other professions. And the chief figure here was Ralph Nader, who at that time was the great advocate for the consumer. His view was that fixed fee schedules, these limitations on competition, were hurting the poor and the middle class because they were artificially inflating the cost of professional services. And so people who needed those professional services weren't having access to them. So from the left and from the right, you had this series of attacks, political, but also legal. The US Department of Justice, lawyers there, brought a series of lawsuits under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, it wasn't just aimed at architects. In fact, it was primarily at doctors and lawyers, but engineers and architects got caught in this as well. And over the course of the 60s and the 70s, there was a series of lawsuits going up to the US Supreme Court. And at the end of it, the entire system of kind of protection of ethical rules, the idea that your loyalty to your colleagues meant you did not compete, was all down in ruins. Every year, it seemed, the AIA had to rewrite its code of ethics because another clause had just been ruled illegal. Finally, in 1980, the AIA just gave up entirely. And for 7 years, the AIA did not have a code of ethics because every single version that they'd had, they were so dumbfounded by this change that they didn't know what to do. What actually happened, the organization that then stepped into the breach was the NCARB, the Council of Architectural Registration Boards. And the man who wrote the new code of ethics was a lawyer named Carl Sapers, who ultimately became my mentor in the law of architecture and in the ethics of architecture. Carl was the general counsel for NCARB, and he wrote a new code of ethics that said nothing about competition. Basically, it was all focused on the quality of your professionalism, that what was most important to architects was that they live up to the highest standards of the standard of care, that they owed that duty to their clients. And that, in fact, if architects were incompetent, registration boards should have the power to disqualify them and to take away their licenses, which had almost never happened up until that point. Ultimately, the AIA kind of adopted a new code of ethics that built upon these NCARB rules, which, as I said, primarily have to do with living up to professional standards. and started then to address some of the other questions that had come up in the 60s and the 70s. The second big attack on the profession in the 60s and the 70s was the discrimination that architects had had against their own colleagues. In 1970, and let me just read the language. The Aia Code of Ethics began with these words: "The profession of architecture calls for men of integrity, culture, acumen, creative ability, and skill." So with language like that, it's perhaps no surprise that in 1970, the membership of the AIA was 99% male and 99.5% white. It's not, despite that language, of course, is enormously encouraging and indicative of a mindset. There were never explicit bylaws that said that women or minority architects could not be admitted to the AIA. It was not like a Jim Crow set of laws, but there was a whole series of practices that had the effect of discrimination. I had mentioned the rules against architects being involved in construction. Well, one of the impacts of that was that if you were poor, if you had taken an alternative route into the profession, if you had begun as a builder, if your practice involved construction and real estate development, as well as design, even if you were an architect as skilled as Emery Roth, the architect of these great towers on the west side of Manhattan that you see from Central Park, he had come to the US as a poor Jewish immigrant, built up an extraordinary practice, but because his practice involved construction and real estate development as well as architecture, he was not admitted to the New York AIA in the 1920s. Or if you did get into a firm and you were an African-American architect like Julian Abeel, you would find your opportunities stunted in a series of ways. Abeel got a superb education where he was a top student at the University of Pennsylvania, became the top designer for Horace Trumbauer, an architect with a national practice. But for over 30 years, although he was designing buildings as prominent as the Philadelphia Art Museum, shown right here, he was never given public recognition for his work, and he was never offered an ownership stake in the firm. So again, these patterns of discrimination were woven deeply into architectural practice. Or if you were an architect like Nathalie de Blois, she was the first woman partner in SOM in the 1950s, had a wonderful touch for design, was the designer for this, the PepsiCo World Headquarters, which is on Park Avenue, and is one of the most delicate and elegant international style buildings of the 1950s. She did get made partner, but again, she also never got the recognition that her male partners like Gordon Bunshaft got as the prominent design figures in SOM. And she never had the same degree of voice, of authority in the running of the firm. So all of this, which had kind of taken for granted in the 60s and the 70s, all of a sudden young architects and young architecture students in particular said, what's wrong with the profession? Why is the face of the profession all male and all white? So that was a second great kind of challenge on the standard version of ethical loyalties, where those loyalties had fallen short. And then the third was this question that architects were being posed. So just where is your loyalty to the public? All of a sudden you had community groups protesting against the destruction of low-income neighborhoods for urban renewal, protesting against the destruction of natural resources, protesting against the demolition of historic buildings like Penn Station here in Manhattan. The protests here even it involved not only advocacy figures like Jane Jacobs and architectural historians like Lewis Mumford, the architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable, Jackie Kennedy was involved. Even architects started to criticize their own profession for not really heeding and being good stewards of the civic realm. But we know the result of what happened to Penn Station, and we know the Penn Station that we have today. As Vincent Scully, the architectural historian, said, the old Penn Station was a place where you entered the city like a god. Now you scuttle in like a rat. And it was that sense of a betrayal of the public, a betrayal of the public realm, a betrayal and of the city and of the natural landscape that really kind of startled and undid much of the profession in the 60s and the 70s. They protested. They said, but we didn't make these decisions. Our clients made these decisions. We didn't decide to tear down Penn Station. Our clients decided, and we were just carrying out their brief. To which the answer was, well, you forfeited our trust. And that if we can't trust for you to speak up for the public, then the public is going to impose new restrictions. And it was in the 60s and the 70s that architectural design really becomes regulated, that laws of historic preservation, laws for environmental protection, design review laws within zoning all come into effect, so that it is now law and not just ethics that becomes a control on architects, law that is the way to enforce their loyalty to the public. So I'm now, so that's those are really the three great challenges of the 60s and the 70s. So now I want to kind of bring the story up to the present. I'm going to give one example of a new conception of ethical loyalties and a new conception of how we can rethink architectural practice to think about these broadening and expanding our loyalties to our clients, to our colleagues, and to the public. And then I'm going to close with kind of a series of questions and some time for discussion. The example I'm going to give here is one that I've really been privileged to be a part of. It's a nonprofit architecture firm called Mass Design Group. I knew its founders from when they were students at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and I continued to work with them. I provide legal services for them, but really as an observer of, I think, an extraordinary story. They began with a single building, which they designed while they were still students. It was completed while they were still students. It is a hospital in the Central African country of Rwanda, a country that had been devastated by civil war and genocide. And this group of students offered their services to Partners in Health, a nonprofit, to help them come up with a better model of hospital design. They spent a lot of time in Rwanda talking with the doctors and the nurses and understanding the problems. They came to understand that the electricity was going to be going out pretty much every day. And so you had to rely upon passive systems of heating and cooling and extensive use of natural light rather than relying upon mechanical systems. They understood that these hospitals were going to have large wards. There wasn't the resources for individual patient rooms. No one had really thought about the architecture of hospital wards since the time of Florence Nightingale, but these young architects thought, well, what if we rethink these spaces? What if we turn them inside out? What if we put a wall down the middle that puts all of the services in that wall in a more efficient way, and then all of the beds can have their heads up against the wall and you can be looking out the window. Every patient can have a view of nature rather than looking at a room full of other sick people. And what they really came to understand from talking to doctors is that the hospitals that existed at that time were making more people sick than they were well. This is what Mass Design came up with. Because what they were being told is that hospitals with interior corridors are breeding grounds of disease. As people were camping out there, waiting for keeping their loved ones company, diseases were being transmitted within these buildings. The architects here thought, this is a very temperate climate. There's no reason why circulation can't be in exterior arcades that would run along the buildings, that would connect the buildings with one another. And that way, then you're providing a healthy environment instead of a breeding ground of disease. So it was, I think, a fascinating project, a very idealistic project, and one where the fact that they were offering volunteer services supported by some grants that they were able to get, made it possible to provide a high quality of design to a client and a community that had not been able to take advantage of this in the past. But what I really, though, want to focus on is not so much the architecture as the practice. One of the founders of Mass Design Group, Alan Ricks, likes to say that our longest running project is our constant reinvention of our practice. And that's really what this means, is that what the founders thought is, how could we replicate this? How would it be possible to create a nonprofit firm that is sustainable and therefore can continue to offer these services to this wider range of clients and communities who can't otherwise afford architecture? So a couple of points. One is, being a nonprofit firm doesn't mean that you are not businesslike. It actually means you have to be more businesslike than ever, because you have to go out and fundraise. You have to find foundations and governments and individuals who will donate money. And those donors are going to want to know that you are living up to your ideals. You have to be very meticulous about your selection of projects and demonstrating that every project is going to be in the service of your goals, whether it is, in the case of Mass Design, healthcare, schools also in Rwanda, regenerating damaged ecosystems, and then affordable housing and public memorials. They've also taken the principle, which they learned from Partners in Health, this health nonprofit, that if you're going to work in these communities, one of your responsibilities, one of your loyalties to the client and to the public is to give back and to help make that community stronger. In Rwanda, they created the first architecture school in the country. And the largest office of Mass Design Group, which today is in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, is now largely comprised of Rwandan architects who were trained in that school and have now risen to leadership roles in the firm. They also have taken a very collaborative attitude towards construction, wherever they can, kind of hiring local craftsmen and giving them the opportunities to kind of develop their skills. It's interesting, I began this lecture with the Masons Guild. In the Butaro Hospital, it was a collective of Masons who learned how to work this local stone, do the beautiful stonework, and have then built a practice where they go around the country doing this kind of masonry work, training their own apprentices. So as I've said, this is one model of an ethic of a rethinking of the practice of architecture that is driven by this idea of ethics, driven by this idea of expanding our loyalties. And in the United States, their best, I think their most important project, here is another one in Rwanda, the first national agricultural college for the nation, where the campus is also a model of regenerating damaged ecosystems. And in the United States, their most prominent work has been, again, this notion of loyalty to the larger public, and in this case, to using the tools of architecture in the cause of social justice. They were approached by Brian Stevenson, the great civil rights lawyer, and his organization, the Equal Justice Institute, which works on reform of the criminal justice system. And part of their work was deep historical research into the history of racial lynchings in the United States, of documenting the more than 4,000 victims across the country between Reconstruction and World War II. and then asking Mass Design Group to use the tools of architecture to dramatize this, to kind of make this story available. These are the monuments. There are 800 of them lying on the ground, one for each of the counties where lynchings took place. Some of them have already been taken off the site to be erected in those counties, and the rest are waiting for their place. And then on the top of the hill is what looks like it has something of the feeling of a classical temple. But when you come close, you see that the columns are a second set of monuments with the names of the counties, the names of the victims. They are suspended from the roof, from the entablature. They don't quite touch the ground, because as you walk around, the ground starts to drop away. And so you walk down underneath the monuments, down to the deepest point, kind of a point of meditation, a place where really all of the tools of architecture have been used to kind of create a sense of sorrow and terror and pity. But all of it really in the service, as I would suggest, of this ethical notion of expanding our loyalties to the broader public. So with this, I want to now kind of close with a series of questions. From these rethinkings in the 70s and 60s, I think a series of questions are being posed, and we're still wrestling with them today, and you're going to be wrestling with them for your entire careers. The idea of our loyalty to our colleagues. How can we expand that idea of loyalty to have a profession that is truly equitable and truly inclusive? NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects, has done extraordinary work for 50 years, and they are more central than ever to the future of the profession. Again, these are all collective efforts. On the right, I've got images from a project that was actually begun by former students of mine. It's called Girl Uninterrupted, and it began with a nationwide poll of the experiences of young women architects and what had they encountered early in their careers and what were the impediments towards to their careers, out of which has then grown a series of manuals helping firms as well as individual architects to figure out ways that we can all do better. Our loyalty to our clients, I think we understand means expanding notions of practice. What are our models of practice? This is an image from the famous Rural Studio at Auburn University. And these models of design build work that give students this hands-on experience are of course being replicated in schools around the country and are really, I think, giving us a new sense of what is design education. One that, as I suggest, is a complete departure from the history of those old ethical codes, is now grappling with bringing design and construction back together. Our loyalty to our clients is also now, I think, really seriously being challenged by, are there clients we should not be working for? After many years, just last year, for the first time, the AIA has revised its code of ethics to say that it would be unethical to design a space where executions take place or where long-term solitary confinement takes place. So that there are certain kinds of projects, that architects should not be putting their skills to. This was a long debate. And these debates will continue on. I know from the history of architecture that 200 years ago, solitary confinement was considered a great reform in prisons. Architects were proposing prisons using solitary confinement because it was considered much more humane than the miserable conditions under which people were being imprisoned at that time. So these are constantly changing understandings that we will be thinking about. And the issue that, of course, all of you are thinking about, that is one that will dominate all of our careers for a generation and more, is that of climate change and the environment. And here, what I would like to kind of suggest as a kind of a final suggestion, and then we will go to questions, is thinking about our loyalty to the public. I mentioned how in the 60s and the 70s, it was a sense of a loss of trust from the public that led to environmental regulation. Well, what if architects were not passive? Instead of simply working within regulations, what if architects actively got involved in shaping regulations, shaping environmental policies, showing how the tools of law can be used to help reshape our communities? I had an extraordinary experience a couple of years ago, my colleagues and me in our law firm, to work with a team of engineers and architects to rewrite the entire zoning code for the city of Boston to deal with the next 50 years of sea level rise, with the fact that Boston Harbor will be 3 feet higher at least 50 years from now than it is today. And how can the zoning code be rewritten to send the right signals for that? That's just one example. Every community across the country is going to think about this, every state, the federal government, and there is enormous opportunity for architects here, I believe, to really play a role and to use your design skills to reshape laws, reshape policies, and expand our loyalty to the public. So with that, I'm going to close, and I think we're now going to invite questions. You can use the chat function. Lon and I will kind of take a look at that, and we'll start listen. I'm going to start reading some of the questions, and hope to have a continuing discussion. So thank you, and let's now move on to the next stage.
Great, Jay. Thank you so much. That is incredible. So I think that the way we've identified we'll organize this, as Jay is sort of alluding to, is we invite the audience to enter in questions in the chat. I'll be looking there as well. If someone has, if those in the audience have some questions, please just go ahead and type a few in. And I think we'll just, Jay, maybe we'll just sort of pause there for a second and give everyone a chance to begin to participate. Okay. Well, Jay, there will be questions. I'm sure they're coming, but I think I'll start something. It's really, really kind of an inspiring kind of presentation in a sense to go all the way back and look at the kind of history of these conflicting interests, if you will. And I think as you move through that and you moved your focus up to contemporary times, I think things get obviously kind of very complex from a kind of social standpoint, if you will, and the way you kind of highlight the work of the Mass Design Group, I think, is really quite wonderful and poignant. I feel like, on a certain level, it would be interesting for you to speak to ways large and small. I mean, I'm thinking about all of the young practitioners or people who are even mid-career that have found themselves sort of wrestling with this over time, but they're in practices, they're working in for-profit practices that can still leverage quite a bit of agency for the public good, let's say. I'm just wondering if you've found examples where this kind of ethic that's represented by the Mass Design Group as a kind of a new blueprint, if you will, has found its way over into more recognizable models of practice that that's beginning to kind of sort of reconsider their position and remake themselves on some dimension, on some axes.
Yeah. No, Lon, I think that's a great question, because we can't all work for nonprofits. And what you said, I think I can give a number of examples. I think, first of all, within firms, I think it's a time of remarkable ferment within firms, both large and small. Many large firms have actually created kind of nonprofit wings within themselves or pro bono programs. And this is something that this is something very comparable to law. That large law firms, I think, very often kind of pride themselves on having pro bono programs so that lawyers can get involved in this kind of work. I think I'm seeing that happen with architecture firms as well. I think that will, in fact, be a way probably in which firms will compete with each other to get talented, idealistic people by giving them these kinds of opportunities. I've also, I see, within the area of sustainability, which I probably know the most about, more and more firms really kind of reorganizing themselves, having directors of sustainability, dedicating kind of teams who are really doing research, making sure that the firm is, fully up to date, and then educating, acting as kind of peer reviewers on projects, so that I think firms are kind of pushing themselves in that kind of way as well. So I think that's, again, all of these ethical issues, what I would really say is it's the power of cooperation and getting together, whether as students, whether with your colleagues within a firm, or getting involved in local chapters of the AIA. There are these meetings called the grassroots meetings where all of the local chapters, I said a lot of harsh things about the AIA, I realize, in the course of this talk. But I do feel, in fact, there's a lot of the organization is really trying to transform itself. And at the local level, local chapters can be enormously involved and hands-on in supporting projects, getting involved in legal reforms, changes to building codes, developing support for community-based projects. So there's a number of examples, that I'd really encourage people to explore.
Great. I do have a follow-up question but I think I'm going to save it for a second, because we have a question from the audience here that I'll read out if that's okay. So this is Stephen Whitney. Professional liability insurance is an expensive cost of architectural business. How do architects shield themselves in the new ethical litigious world? Yet litigious world, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, okay. That's I think that is an interesting question. There are plenty of lawsuits in the construction field, but I would say there's a couple of different ways to look at that. For quite some time, I think the architectural profession took a very defensive stance, about that. AIA's standard contracts in the 1960s and 70s were largely driven by fears of lawsuits. And they say almost more about what the architect won't do rather than about what the architect will do. Two things I would say, one is, first of all, just from a business viewpoint, there's what's known as the balance of risk and reward. If you want to make more money, you need to accept more risk. And that may mean getting more deeply, offering a broader range of services, perhaps getting more involved in construction than architects typically have in the past. But I would say the bigger point for me actually has to do with client trust and client loyalty. What I kind of always sort of say to my, to students and also to my clients is the best defense against a lawsuit is a strong, trusting relationship with your client. And that means that that means, among other things, admitting when you've made mistakes. When something goes wrong, and something goes wrong on every project, rather than hiding or pointing fingers, to say, I'm going to get in there and fix the problem. I'm going to help you solve this and figure out how to make this work. And so I think that's my general attitude is, architects are great problem solvers. Don't be afraid. Get in there, fix the problem, build the relationships, and think broadly about all the ways that you can use your design skills.
Well, it's interesting to follow up on that actually pretty directly. It seems like smaller organizations are positioned in a very unique way to take advantage of that. So they can cultivate more direct, arguably even kind of trusting relationships with clients. They can, roll their sleeves up and get into the messy process of, let's say, construction in a more straightforward way, whereas larger firms that significantly larger firms that we would identify as kind of corporate in their organizational structure might be far more risk averse in terms of kind of developing those kinds of relationships.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that has been true. One of the things though you look at like the big mega firms, you look at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in the 1950s and the organization chart, and it was very hierarchical. There were a few partners at the top and a lot of drones underneath them. That is not so true these days, even in larger firms. They tend to be organized on a much flatter, more horizontal way in teams. My experience is even in large firms, the project architects, the principals in charge develop their own very strong relationships with clients. It's almost like a lot of what you would think would be large firms are actually collections of mini practices. And they may have multiple studios, each of which has kind of its own flavor, does different kinds of work, takes different kinds of approaches. So, understanding, the culture of architecture firms is very interesting. And as students are looking ahead, thinking about and seeing what you can learn about a firm that you're interested in as a social organism, not just the quality of the work, does it produce pretty pictures, but what kind of a place is it like to work, and is it truly collaborative and engaging and imaginative in that way?
Great. Here's another question.
Jump in?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Florencia. I'm also teaching Integrated Studio with Lon, and I just want to say this was a fantastic lecture. I keep taking notes and notes of all the history of the architects and the clients. I am an architect from Argentina. I'm licensed there. I'm not licensed here, but I practice and I look at the code, and I just always think about, the issues that could be, so limited in this country. Some things are very important and safe and aspects that are all these laws that shape. I think I quote that the laws that shape, because for me, these laws also shape the architecture, because I just look around what is being built now, and it's just as a middle ground, no high-end architecture or low-end architecture, but like the middle ground, and you see what's being built, and you're thinking, okay, yeah, it's just up to code. It's up to code, and so I always think, okay, maybe that's the way. Maybe you gotta go through the laws to be a real designer, like to understand how to shape. But I think it's fascinating for all the students to see the possibilities, particularly of the examples that you show of the practicing collaboratively. I think engaging the community and understanding social and environmental issues. I mean, it's just like I feel like sometimes I feel like I wish I have studied law, but it's just like that thing about like the relationship between the law and then what's the architectural outcome.
Well, and I think going to your point, as I said, I had suggested, first of all, I think there's great opportunities for architects to get involved in reshaping laws. It's too important to leave zoning and building codes and design review to the lawyers. The architects should be involved.
Exactly.
But also, I think, and I think this will be true. One of the great conflicts between loyalty to your client versus loyalty to the public is, architects are developing enormous knowledge about what is possible to do for sustainable design. But what if your client doesn't really want to pay for it, doesn't understand? It's my belief that increasingly environmental regulations will become the architect's friend. That you can use. I've seen this in landscape architects. Many landscape architects become very adept at using environmental protections as a way of showing the client they really need to do something the landscape architect wanted them to do anyhow. And I think, the more that architects can understand the purpose of environmental regulations that are going to be aimed at dealing with climate change, at improving energy performance, but at dealing with sea level rise, I think architects are going to find that those regulations can be your friend in helping to shape a project in a very positive way.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, just to follow up on that real quick, it seems like architects have a tremendous responsibility in terms of climate change, and that might be kind of obvious to state. But I've been recently reading Bill Gates's new book on how to avoid a climate disaster, and it's fascinating also to share with colleagues and students because although we're all, I think, aware of the impact that the built environment has and so on and so forth. And we're sort of somehow aware that architects play a role in that. But, when you understand and you see the data on the carbon intensive processes of concrete and steel and their predominance in the construction industry, you're sort of left wondering like, oh my God, there's really nothing left to work with in a way. So in a certain sense, we're in a unique position of exploring and researching new materials and leveraging that knowledge into best practices. And again, you speak of this kind of loyalty to the client in a certain way, being in the kind of role of convincing the client to think differently about construction as a means of even being loyalty to the public, i.e. thinking about the carbon footprint of these buildings, both in terms of their production and their use. I think there are interesting opportunities there. It's a little bit of a conflict again, because some new and emerging systems, approaches, construction systems, energy systems, and so on and so forth, we're maybe not sure of their overall, kind of efficacy, if you will, right? And so I suppose the question is maybe not a question and more of a kind of quandary, if we're sort of, I feel like the architect sort of always finds themselves sort of in between, like the three poles that the two poles that you pointed out, and now the third one being very kind of clearly there, forms a kind of balancing act for us as a profession. I think that's very, very interesting, and I think it's an important and unavoidable responsibility in a way, and a burden to bear on some level, but an exciting one. So, I suppose it'd be interesting to hear if you, in your practice, you're also seeing discussions of sustainability at the level of material usage, consumption, and energy systems that where architects would be working with those ideas and specifying those systems on a day-to-day basis even?
Well, one of the ways that that's a great questions, Lon, and you're right. There is a challenge. There are a lot of new materials and systems coming out. At the same time, and this goes back to something I'm very interested in about thinking about how we expand our ideas of practice. There's a very interesting way in which the challenge of sustainability and climate change is kind of coming back around and reconnecting with historic preservation, in the sense that the vast majority of buildings that we need to adapt already exist. We can't solve climate change by just designing wonderful new buildings. It's the entire stock of everything that already exists that we need to find ways to rethink. And that's, the profession historically has not focused as much on renovation, on existing buildings. And yet, my colleague in Boston, Gene Caroon, likes to say the greenest building is an old building. Because it's not expending energy on construction. The structure is already there. The less you demolish, the less construction energy you're going to consume on construction and demolition. And so there's a whole area there of opportunity. It's hard to teach in school. It's hard to set design problems for the reuse of existing buildings, but I'm also convinced that that's a major part of the future of the profession, and we should see it as a great opportunity. It's very interesting that this year's winners of the Pritzker Prize are French architects who have specialized in reusing existing buildings, and sometimes in saying, we're not going to do a new building. What's there is almost all right, and some simple modifications can make it more energy efficient, more livable, more humane. So that's, I think, another side of it. So I see here, I'm kind of looking at the chat, in a couple of, here was a question kind of going to the point that I mentioned about this recent change in the ethical code about the design of prisons. And, there's the question, are there certain spaces which should be prohibited? And let's see, whoops, I'm sorry, let me just, I'm getting a bunch of questions now, but, in effect, is there a kind of an architectural boycott that would stop certain spaces from existing? Now, the challenge, of course, is that the Aia Code of Ethics, is not law. So it's saying, as an ethical architect, you should not be involved in creating these spaces. It doesn't mean they won't be created. And that's then, of course, a debate. There are many other buildings that may be socially questionable, and yet does that mean we don't want any design talent to go into making them better? Should architects not be involved in prisons at all? I mean, these are not easy questions at all. And so, there's a range of, you can make an individual ethical decision for my personal ethics or my firm, we will not do this work. You could make a kind of a collective decision within the AIA that as a member, you should not do this work. But then it's not until society as a whole actually changes the law to say certain kinds of structures will not be built or certain kinds of uses will not take place, that you ultimately have that kind, a complete bar. Now, let's see. Yeah. Now here's another observation. This kind of goes to the issue of, I don't know how, and you should tell me how many more questions, but here's a very interesting one, to the issue of racial justice. And here's someone who's pointing out that the AIA was founded in 1857. That was just as the Dred Scott decision was being handed down, and as the United States was heading into the Civil War, and that there was, first of all, I think there's been, very important work being done on the national monuments in Washington, D.C. The Capitol building, the White House, these were largely built with slave labor because the District of Columbia was a slave state up until the end of the Civil War. And so there's, I think, just as the Equal Justice Institute has been doing that kind of historical research, there's a lot of very important understanding and memory that we need to do about how racial injustice is woven into our structures and into, some of our most important buildings. At the same time, it's interesting, there were some very important campaigning efforts in the post-Civil War era for architectural education in particular. And interestingly, at the Tuskegee Institute, there was a young professor, an African-American professor who had been trained at MIT, who went down and started the first architecture program there. And it was a program in design build that the students not only designed, they actually designed and then built the new buildings on the campus. And so the Tuskegee campus was actually created by the African-American architecture students at that school. So there's an entire kind of largely unknown history of both the tragic but also the inspiring side of racial justice in American architecture that we have a great deal to learn about. And I think that needs to be kind of central to our ethical understanding and our ethical aspirations. Let's see. Well, and then here was a, there's also a question, there's also a question here even on how architects get selected. And that's a debate as well about, what is fair among to your colleagues, what is also best serves the clients. It's interesting that if you go to Europe, in most European nations, most civic buildings are awarded by design competitions. And, I think in those countries, it's really felt that gives much more opportunity to young architects to be able to develop their practices, and for clients, therefore, to be able to have kind of a richer set of ideas. It's interesting that in the U.S., that does not happen very often. It tends to be more requests for qualifications where you have to demonstrate you have designed this kind of building a number of times before, which maybe gives some confidence of quality, but it also may really cut into opportunities for new ideas. And then as this question has, someone asked this question, more and more there seem to be requests for proposals. It's not just what have you done, but how much are you going to charge? A kind of a competitive bidding, setting up a competitive bidding situation. In most states, you can't do that for public work. In many states, architects still have to be chosen by their qualifications for public work, but they can be chosen based on price for private work. And I would say, the only answer to that really is to kind of demonstrate your inventiveness. We do live in a competitive marketplace. Where those court decisions of the 1970s are not going to get undone as much as some people might like to. And so I think the answer is not to go back to fixed fee schedules. The answer is to be more inventive, more imaginative about the services that we can offer, and the ways in which architects can use design skills in ways that haven't really been thought of before. So that would be, I think that's a bit of a long-winded answer to this question about how architects are selected. And any further, Lon, you should say if there's another question that you're particularly picking up on here, but
no, I don't know. I think there's maybe I think that's it.
Okay.
I think so. Yeah. Look, I mean, we'll bring it to an end there. I mean, and great presentation and an engaging set of questions and responses. And thank you again on behalf of the school and my colleagues and the students. I look forward to inviting you back and continuing the conversation.
Well, it was wonderful. And I guess, as I said, the last thing is, don't listen to us old folks. You're going to be reinventing practice, and you're going to be reinventing your ideas about ethics and what good ethical behavior is. And I really look forward to seeing what some of those answers are going to be. So thanks so much for this opportunity. And it's been a really wonderful evening.
Thank you. Okay. Goodbye.
Good night.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.